Hello everyone, this is Alex here, and today I'm excited to bring you a very special video for me, for a couple of reasons. For one, I've never built a Gundam before, so this is going to be my very first kit, starting with the original Gundam, the iconic RX-78-2. But secondly, and more importantly, this for me marks the beginning of my plastic model journey. Now I decided to warm up and begin with something precisely like this, because it's supposed to be a very straightforward kit. As far as Gunpla kits go, Gunpla just meaning Gundam Plastic Model Kit, made by Bandai by the way, this is an entry grade. And as the name suggests, this is the most basic and easiest to build out of all the categories they have. They mentioned that you don't really require anything else outside the box in order to build this model, but I plan to go a little bit beyond the kit and start practicing my modeling techniques with these tools and materials right here. Since I'm just starting, I didn't want to overdo it, so I gave myself a $50 budget, that's Canadian dollars, and managed to spend just around $35 for all of this, not counting this basic kit, which I already had and was also fairly cheap. And I will be covering each and one of these later on as I go through the build. Okay, time to open up this thing. Now I have to admit I've done some plastic modeling in the past, but like way in the past when I was a kid. And I think I only ever managed to complete something like a very small plane back then. That's why I pretty much feel like I'm in square one in regards to plastic modeling at the moment. So as one could expect from this basic kit, there's not much going on inside the box. I go ahead and just spend some time familiarizing with Gunpla instructions and just analyzing the build before I do anything with it. I go on and open up these plastic bags to see what I'm working with. So the very first thing I decide to do is to clean out the runners. I use two shoebox sized containers that I fill about halfway with water. One will have soapy water for washing, while the other one is used for rinsing the pieces after. And as far as I've learned, any kind of generic dish soap will work just fine for this. After having stirred up the soapy water, I go ahead and just drop all the runners into it. Here I bring one of my new supply items, a soft toothbrush that will be easy on the pieces for the actual cleaning and scrubbing. So generally, the reason behind this step is to remove impurities in the plastic in order to have a clean surface for doing any kind of paint job later on. And I would take a moment to disclaim that I did some previous homework in preparation for this build. Many of these techniques and materials that I will be trying out have come from general research and video tutorials online. I wanted to get closer to the source material and get some actual background on what I was building. So I even started watching the original Gundam animated series from the late 70s that featured this specific mobile suit design. Over time, I hope to discover some exciting new designs throughout the Gundam universe that make me want to root for future kits to build later on. Once I have everything cleaned and upon closer inspection of the pieces, I discover some visible flow marks on the plastic from their injection process. It's unfortunate, but in reality I can hardly notice it most of the time. Okay, so as I am ready to properly begin the build, I actually decide to flip the instructions over to start with the last step that takes care of the weapon and shield accessories. They'll be my scapegoat pieces for familiarizing with the new materials, simply because I wouldn't mind making early mistakes here as much as I would on the figure. Now the kit says you don't really need any tools for this, and my intention is to practice with these tools, but for now I'll just try feeling the snapping first. I carefully fidget them around trying to snap them because at this point I have no idea how fragile this plastic is and I'm trying to get a feel for it. I slowly start picking up the pace as I continue with the shield pieces. Once I get my pieces out of the runners, it is time to deal with one of the trademarks of plastic modeling. The infamous nub marks left from the snapped connections with the sprues. Now there's an industry of options to deal with these little guys, but in my case, I'm starting simple. So here's a quick overlook of what I'll be using from here on. Most of the tools I got them from this basic crafting kit I bought on Amazon a while ago. With time, I'm sure I'll be getting a feeling on what I need to begin upgrading. As for now, first I want to start with these three kinds of files of varying grades for sanding purposes. A very small metallic one and two double-sided files, one of which has also two ends with different grits. Next, a set of simple double-edged pliers for snapping pieces out of the runners. And finally, just your average crafting knife for multi-purpose work. One of its first jobs is precisely cutting away this excess plastic on those unsightly nubs. I tried to chip away as much plastic as possible with the knife, being careful not to damage the piece and trying to get comfortable with the technique. What's next is to try out the files, which hopefully will make those nub marks disappear. I gave it a go to the metallic one and tested the black double-sided one too, but they felt way too rough for this kind of job. On the other hand, the third file with the softer 3 grids was much more helpful. Once I moved on to work on the shield, I began to notice how the nub marks seemed easier to erase on the colored pieces. I think mainly because the polystyrene that this kit is made of turns white when stressed and snapped, making it seemingly easier to fade on white and yellow pieces in particular. Feeling satisfied with the sanding, I move on to the assembly. Now the magic of this kit is that there is no glue involved at all. They just cleverly snap together to form the assembly. These weapon pieces, for example, just lock together with their matching male-female connections. But I quickly noticed jumping to the shield how the snap and clutch shapes get a little bit more complex than that. Alright, time to deal with the figure build. Although once again, I'll take a little detour and start working with step 2 on the torso segment. This time around, I will try using the nippers to take out the pieces. I do some quick practice on the runners to get a feel for how they cut. And here you can see the difference between using the flat side or the wedge side of the nippers. The flat side having a much cleaner cut. Here I begin nipping away the pieces, making the cut away from where the piece connects to remove it from the sprue. Then I come back with the nippers and get rid of the excess plastic. Somehow, I was feeling a little uneasy while using my nippers during this process, and it didn't change much as I kept moving on with the next pieces. It got to the point where unfortunately I ended up damaging one of the pieces despite trying to be careful. At least with some sanding I was able to somewhat disguise my mistake, but in summary I was not feeling very comfortable using them. So I decided to put them away and went back to just snapping out the pieces as the kit suggests, much quicker and with even cleaner nub marks left to remove. Here, for example, I was bothered by what felt like a loosened or improper fit, until I realized it's just part of the waist articulation. Such happy surprises came through the build as I started to notice all the interesting possible articulations on this basic kit. With enough try and error, I get on track to move on with the build. I snap away all the pieces needed for each step. I then follow with doing some cleaning and sanding to take care of the nub marks before moving on with the proper assembly. I complete the torso section by closing up the back with the jetpack and saber hilts, as well as some final ball joint articulations. Once the torso is complete, I move on to the arms next. And so, as I continue on repeating the same process over for each sub-assembly, I began to notice how I was slowly getting quicker and more comfortable. So now that I have been working on the kit for a while, I decided it's time to jump back to step 1 in the instructions and deal with the head. It just feels so much nicer now being able to approach with much more confidence on such a noticeable and iconic element. And with this particular sub-assembly, there is one piece I felt needed some modification. As you can see, the horns, antenna, or whatever you want to call them should end in a sharp point, unlike the piece which is thick and blunt. So I go ahead and make quick work of it, carefully removing the excess with my hobby knife. I believe this is just a precaution to avoid sharp edges for the suggested age range. Looking at it assembled, I keep getting amazed by the end results, like how the face is created with this kind of kit after simply interlocking a few odd-shaped pieces together. I continue on with the lower section of the figure to finish up the legs. At first, it's pretty much going on at it again, repeating the same process as before, as I start working on these feet sub-assemblies. Pulling out the pieces from the sprues, removing those pesky nub marks as best as I can, and finish up by snapping the pieces. But before I can continue on working with the rest of the legs, I will take a moment at this point to address another couple of small custom details that I want to add to this build, which brings me to draw out most of my new materials in order to finally begin playing around with doing some painting. Starting with the cleaning solutions, I'll be using this isopropyl alcohol at 99% that I already happen to have for other purposes, although I believe anything above 70% works just as well and would also be cheaper. In the other bottle on the right is just your regular tap water. In the brush department, I'll be using something that I already had, a fine tip brush that I found in an old box of art supplies. Really not the best brush, as I can see it's noticeably bristled, but I believe it will be just enough for what I need at this moment. I will also be using one of these wooden clothespins that I got in order to hold my brush upright inside the bottle with just the tip submerged inside the liquid. Another nice tip I saw online that keeps the brush wet, clean, and isolated from being bent and damaged. As for my choice of paint, I decided to go with Tamiya's acrylic paints. Now I heard they are not the best recommendation for brush painting, but I needed to consider that my idea is to eventually jump into airbrushing. And from what I could find out, they seem to be generally considered the most versatile and forgiving to work with in that regard. Finally, just some small clear plastic cups for holding and mixing my paint. The first detail I want to cover is here in the knee piece. The image in the box shows this area gray, although I think it might just be how the image is rendered. But there is an inlet or opening there, as I have seen in the show and as you can see clearly in this drawing in the instructions, so I'll be adding a little gray to that area. I start by giving the paint a good shake. I bring out the all-essential toothpicks I got, a set of which I really like their compact size. I take one out and use it to give the paint one final good stir. I also thought useful to get this special Tamiya product for the acrylics, a paint retarder that is supposed to enhance the properties of the paint for when using a brush in order to achieve better results. The suggested ratio is 1 drop of retarder for every 10 of paint. To serve those amounts, in the case of the paint, I set on trying out a pouring technique using the toothpick. I was afraid I was going to make a mess, but fortunately, I managed to get those drops in there cleanly. As for the retarder, I will be using this simple pipette I got to pick up some drops out of the bottle. I thought it would be more appropriate to use this when dealing with thinner liquids rather than using it on the thicker paint. I pour a little more retarder than the suggested ratio just to try and get the paint a little thinner. Once I'm all set, I take the piece out of the runner and get started with painting those gray details. I tried getting an even coat and staying within the working surface, and when I did make a mistake, I would dip the toothpick in the alcohol and use the tip to do the cleanup. I jump between working on the other knee piece as I add a couple of coats to each one. I leave those pieces to dry and I move on to the beam rifle for that second paint detail that I want to cover. Right now, this rifle is looking pretty bland. And looking at this image of a higher grade figure, you can notice how the rifle has a very noticeable yellow scope. So once again, I grab my yellow paint and start with a good shake. I also stir it around a bit, and this time I use a toothpick a little different to pour just a few drops of paint. I get some of that retarder into the mix, and my paint is ready to go. As I begin, I quickly notice that the brighter color comes a little thin on the darker plastic, which just means that I will be needing to add more coats in order to achieve enough opacity and bring that yellow through. It is looking much better now with that added touch of color, and after several coats, I would say the result is almost identical to the actual plastic. As for the knees, they are also looking much fancier now, although apparently I got a bit too desperate when adding those coats of paint, as I didn't quite achieve a smooth surface. I think it's good enough for the first try, and I certainly had fun trying out something new and seeing the results. With all that painting out of the way, I set up to finish the assembly for the rest of the legs and finish pulling out the last remaining pieces of this kit. And before I close up this waist assembly, I wanted to try out one last modification I learned I could do with this front skirt piece. It moves out of the way to allow the legs to articulate up, but because it's only one single piece, it does not move individually for each leg. So I took a calculated risk of cutting it in half. And although I didn't get a perfect cut, it was still able to work out well once I put it together. With all the different segments complete, I move on to the final assembly. I wanted to save them separately until the end so I could enjoy the experience of bringing everything together in one last step. Looking at it complete, I'm amazed by how good the figure looks even in this most basic rendering with this entry grade. Not to mention the fact that it's also a fully articulated model. But there is one final step I want to try out to take this model to the next level, which is of course panel lining. And this is where I bring the rest of my new materials, which consists of these Gundam markers. One is the most basic black panel lining pen available, GM01, for doing all the actual paneling and detailing. And the other one is an eraser marker, GM300, which will help me out in removing any mistakes and for doing some final cleanup. Sadly, I need to take a step back and disassemble the figure into its main components for easier handling. I take a quick moment to sand out some plastic and mold lines that were bothering me. It wasn't really a big deal, but I think you can notice the difference between a finished leg on the left and the untouched one on the right. Okay, time to open up those markers and dive into the panel lining. I will begin my first attempt starting with the accessories first. In this case, it's the back of the shield, which fortunately has many types of ridges, creases and edges where I can get a good chance to try out the pen. I make sure I get into every nook and cranny of this piece, and I deliberately work pretty loosely because I want to practice doing some cleanup after. Once I feel it's fully covered, I switch it over to the eraser marker. Now the deal with this is that you should first pour out some liquid out of the marker by pressing on it. Then you can use something like a cotton swab to absorb the fluid in order to do the actual cleanup. And yes, I quickly felt how it pretty much dissolved the ink, and because I had laid so much of it, it began to get quite messy everywhere. I had to jump frequently between pouring liquid and changing dirty swabs to do the job, making it all the more frustrating. And by the end of it, I had pretty much erased a good deal of the panel lining I had done. So I said to give it another go and repainted the piece. This time I went a little less crazy with the pen, but still making sure I cover every space properly. As for the cleanup, I'm ditching the eraser marker for a different technique that involves using a plain white rubber eraser, which apparently is one of the most effective. And sure enough, as rumors told, it dealt fantastically with removing the ink from unwanted places. Using a thick soft brush after the eraser makes it easier to remove all those excess particles. In the end, it was a way more enjoyable process and the results are night and day after having changed to the eraser. As for the eraser marker at this point, I'm sure I will find its uses in the future. So I turn the shield around and do the same process for the front, filling every crease and concave edge with the pen. I repeat the cleanup method with the eraser, and in this case, looking at it after I'm done, I really like the visual effect of having that slight outline that separates the colored pieces. Next, I continue with the beam rifle, and I feel this one really gets a lift up after giving it a fair pass with the pen. Details are much more clear and easier to read, with more depth to it instead of just being a flat gray object. The added yellow scope doing a lot of the lifting too. Time to switch back to the figure once again. This time, I'm starting with the leg subassemblies, from the very bottom sole to be more specific, as there are a lot of detail in that area that really starts to come up once I begin filling it up with ink. When deciding just how much I was planning to panel line, I set my goal to cover the entire figure, even in those places that wouldn't be very visible or would be hidden under certain articulations. I really aimed to get a consistent look so I wouldn't have to worry about seeing unfinished areas exposed when posing it or when moving it and playing around with it. With a quick comparison between the finished and unfinished leg, I start to feel really excited about where this is all going, and it is here that I realize just how toyish the figure looks without the panel lines added to it. Not that I thought it looked bad before, but this is just a step above. Moving on to work on the other leg, I decide to do a little bit more disassembly to ease the panel lining process. This would also end up being true for some of the other sub-assemblies down the line. And as I get into a comfortable pace, I start to make quick progress, jumping around between going back to the pen, using the eraser, and brushing away dust. From here on, there's really not much else that I have to comment about this step, so I will leave you with a short sequence of the rest of the process, or you can just skip ahead to see the end result. Coming up on finishing the head, I'm again impressed by how good it looks, even before the panel lining, but once again, this just enhances everything. All that's left is to assemble the figure back together. And after fitting the shield and beam rifle, I can say that this build is officially done. Having a final good look at the completed build, I feel it turned out looking much better than what I was expecting. I'm amazed by how articulate this figure is. Maybe this is nothing for somebody experienced with this type of kit, but as a beginner, I get excited imagining how much better the higher grades can be in every regard. But still, I think this entry model is looking quite respectable. I particularly like how the figure ended up having this kind of 2D anime effect with a consistent black panel line all around. Also, seeing how they added paint helped break the plainness of the gray and white for the rifle and legs respectively. Alright, so that's going to be it for this video. I certainly learned a lot with this introduction into plastic modeling, but most importantly, I had a great time doing it. I hope it was the same for you, and thank you all very much for joining me today. Have a good one, and catch you all next time. Goodbye!